"You need a home, and I need a mother for my daughter," said the lonely CEO, Millionaire, to the shivering nurse. At the station, snow lay thick over New York, muffling the city under a white, breathless silence. Past midnight, the streets stood deserted, the streetlights casting pale halos through drifting flakes. The final bus had already left the hospital stop, its taillights swallowed by the storm. Sandra Grace sat hunched on the frozen bench beneath the shelter's narrow canopy. Her nurse's uniform peeked from beneath a thin gray coat, far too light for January. Damp blonde strands clung to her cheeks. Her bare hands were tucked deep into her sleeves, red from the cold. A cough escaped her, sharp against the stillness. She stayed motionless, eyes on the ground, as if refusing to move could somehow hold off the night. The staff lounge had been locked early, the cot she sometimes claimed already out of reach. She could have asked for help, but she was too tired, too proud, too used to slipping into the background. "Just make it until morning," she told herself. "Once I'm back inside, no one will even know I left." The wind swept through the street, scattering snow across her lap. She glanced up, scanning for headlights. Nothing. Then, soft, deliberate, the crunch of tires over ice. A sleek black SUV slowed to the curb. Its headlights washed over her, cutting through the storm. In the back seat, 4-year-old Betty Carter pressed her mittened hands to the glass, breath fogging the pain. Her wide brown eyes fixed on the shivering woman outside. She tugged gently on her father's sleeve. "Daddy?" she said, voice small but sure. "That lady is cold. She looks like she needs help." Nathaniel Carter glanced at his daughter, then at the figure on the bench. He stayed still for a heartbeat too long, jaw tight. He had not planned to stop, but the image pulled at something he had buried 2 years ago, the night he stood in a similar storm outside the ER, waiting for the news that would break him. He could not keep driving. The SUV rolled to a halt. Nathaniel stepped out, retrieving a dark cashmere scarf from the back seat, one of the few keepsakes left from his late wife. He crossed the snow, his steps steady, and draped the scarf over Sandra's shoulders without a word. She flinched slightly, startled, but her hands rose to clutch the soft fabric. It was warm, carrying the faint scent of lavender. "At least keep warm," he said quietly. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Let me give you a ride," he added. "You can't sit out here all night." Sandra hesitated. She had weathered worse nights alone. But a violent cough seized her chest, and then she caught sight of the little girl in the back seat, watching her with open, earnest eyes. That decided it. She rose slowly, her legs stiff with cold, and followed him to the SUV. Inside, the air was warm enough to sting her frozen skin. Betty offered a shy smile. Sandra returned it with a small one of her own. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the steady beat of the wipers. Then Sandra noticed Betty still watching her in the rearview mirror. She reached back gently, smoothing the girl's hair. Betty pulled a pink scrunchie from her wrist and handed it over. Without thinking, Sandra gathered the loose curls and tied them into a neat ponytail. Nathaniel saw it happen in the mirror. Betty had not let anyone touch her hair since her mother died. He cleared his throat. "I was going to take you to a hotel nearby," he began. Then he glanced sideways, meeting her eyes. "You said you don't have a home." A pause. "You need a home." He hesitated, as though testing the weight of the next words. "And I need a mother for my daughter." Sandra froze, unsure she had heard him correctly. She searched his face for mockery, pity, anything false, but found only quiet sincerity. Before she could speak, Betty leaned forward, clutching her teddy bear. "Please stay," she whispered. "Just for my bedtime story?" Sandra looked from the little girl to the man beside her. Outside, snow pressed against the windows. Inside, the warmth was almost disarming. She pulled the scarf closer around her neck. "Okay," she murmured, "just for tonight." The tires crunched softly over fresh snow as the SUV pulled into the driveway. The house stood tall and modern, its stone facade sleek and minimalist. Lights glowed faintly through tall windows, but there was no warmth in their shine. no welcome in the silence that awaited inside. Sandra stepped through the front door hesitantly, her boots leaving a trail of melting snow on the polished hardwood floor. Her eyes moved slowly across the vast entryway, taking in the cool, clean lines, the absence of color, the stillness that seemed too heavy for a home where a child lived. There were no family portraits on the walls, no children's drawings on the fridge, no scattered toys or crumpled blankets on the couch, just space and quiet and the echo of footsteps on expensive wood. "This place feels too quiet," Sandra said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Nathaniel's voice came from behind her. "It has been," he said. Since she passed, Sandra turned slightly, catching the weight in his eyes. She said nothing. Betty, still clutching her bear, slipped her small hand into Sandra's. "Come," the little girl said, tugging gently. "I'll show you my room." Sandra let herself be led down the hallway, her steps matching the child's. Betty pushed open a white door and proudly pointed to the room beyond, a cozy space painted in pale pinks and soft grays. A single lamp glowed near the bed, casting a golden hue across stuffed animals and bookshelves. "I like this one," Betty whispered, picking up a book from the nightstand. "It's about a fox who gets lost in the snow." Sandra smiled, kneeling beside her. "That sounds like a good one." She helped Betty change into her pajamas, brushing the little girl's hair gently with a small pink brush left on the dresser. Betty did not flinch or pull away. Sandra sat at the edge of the bed and began to read, her voice soft and rhythmic. Betty's head slowly drifted onto her lap. Her breathing evened out, her arms around her bear. From the hallway, Nathaniel watched, unseen. He leaned against the door frame, his arms crossed over his chest, a quiet ache building in his throat. The sight of Betty curled up beside Sandra, peacefully asleep. He had not seen that kind of calm in his daughter in months. And Sandra, there was something unforced about the way she cared. No pity, no awkwardness, just presence. "Carl, could this be the beginning of something?" He turned away, quietly. Sandra, still seated on the bed, looked down at the child nestled beside her, her fingers absently brushing Betty's hair. A wave of unexpected warmth crept into her chest. He gently shifted Betty onto her pillow and tucked the blanket up to her chin before slipping out of the room. Nathaniel was waiting in the hallway. "I set up the guest room for you," he said. "It is upstairs, first door on the right." She nodded, following him quietly. The room was small but clean, with soft lighting and a gentle hum from the electric fireplace near the window. A thick quilt had been laid over the bed, and an old armchair sat beside a side table. On that table, a steaming mug of cocoa, and beside it, a folded piece of paper with neat, block handwriting. Billings' hand. "Thank you for staying, even for just tonight." Sandra stood for a long moment, staring at the note. Then she sat in the chair and picked up the mug, letting its warmth seep into her hands. The cocoa was rich, slightly sweet, and real, none of that powdered mix stuff from the hospital lounge. She curled her legs underneath her, holding the mug close. The fire flickered, and for the first time in what felt like years, she let herself breathe. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She had no promises, no guarantees. But tonight, someone had made room for her, even just a little. And that little felt like everything. She held the mug tighter, letting its heat sink into her chest, her shoulders, her bones. Somewhere down the hall, the floor creaked as someone passed by, perhaps Nathaniel checking on Betty. Sandra closed her eyes briefly. It had been a long time since she had been anywhere she did not have to prove she belonged. A long time since she had felt welcome. Just for tonight, that was enough. The next few days passed softly, like snow settling on the ground. Gentle, unnoticed, but changing everything. Sandra woke before sunrise each morning, quietly moving through the house so as not to disturb anyone. She made coffee and scrambled eggs, set out fruit and cereal for Betty, and placed a small folded napkin beside Nathaniel's mug, always with a handwritten note. "Good luck today," or at least, less chaos than yesterday. By the second morning, Nathaniel began to notice the smell of breakfast before his alarm went off. He came downstairs to find the kitchen already full of life. Betty sitting at the counter, legs swinging beneath her stool, her hair tied neatly, her shoes half done. Sandra knelt in front of the child, patiently guiding her fingers through the loops of her shoelaces. "Pull tight here," Sandra said gently. "Then make bunny ears. See?" Betty giggled when she got it wrong, then beamed with pride when she finally did it right. From the doorway, Nathaniel watched in silence. He did not say a word. But something in him shifted. That evening, Sandra offered to make dinner. She was not a gourmet cook, but her food was warm and seasoned with comfort. Rosemary chicken, roasted vegetables, a bowl of mashed potatoes so creamy Betty licked the spoon clean. Afterward, Sandra and Betty stood side by side in the kitchen, elbows deep in flour, giggling as they rolled cookie dough into uneven shapes. The radio played softly in the background. Betty hummed along. Nathaniel stood just outside the doorway, unseen, watching. Betty laughed, really laughed, as Sandra accidentally dropped a spoon and flour puffed into the air around them. It was the kind of sound that echoed in a heart long after it stopped. Later that night, after Betty had changed into pajamas and climbed into bed with her bear, Nathaniel stood at the doorway of her room, watching Sandra tuck the blankets around the girl's small frame. Sandra leaned down and kissed Betty's forehead. "Good night, sweet one," Betty yawned. "Will you read tomorrow, too?" "I will," Sandra whispered. As she stepped into the hallway, Nathaniel remained where he was, arms folded, his voice low. "She has not laughed like that in 2 years." Sandra turned toward him slowly. "She is an amazing little girl. She was 3 when my wife died," he said, eyes still fixed on the nightlight glowing in Betty's room. "She was on call that night, a doctor. She stopped at a car accident on her way home, saved a man trapped inside, but—" He did not finish. Sandra stood beside him, saying nothing. The silence was soft, respectful. After a moment, she looked down at her hands. "My mom was a nurse. She had cancer. I left med school to care for her. She used to say, even when you are hurting, if you can help someone else breathe easier, that is a good day." Nathaniel glanced at her then, really seeing her. He nodded once. Neither of them said another word. The next night, after dinner, Sandra came downstairs to find the dining room transformed. The lights were dimmed. Candles flickered on the table, their flame swaying gently. The radio in the corner played a soft jazz melody, smooth and nostalgic. 2 wine glasses sat waiting, untouched. Nathaniel stepped into the room a moment later, holding a plate of simple cheese and crackers. "I thought," he said, almost apologetically, "you might want a moment, just for you." Sandra looked at the table, then back at him. A long pause stretched between them. Then she smiled. "Thank you," she said, and for that night, at least, there was no past, no ghosts, just warmth and the flicker of something fragile, something like peace. The storm had passed, but the night was still. Cold air lingered like memory, heavy and unmoving. It was well past midnight when Sandra jolted awake, her heart thudding, unsure why. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then she heard it, a soft whimper, muffled through walls. A child's cry. She threw on her robe and stepped into the hallway, feet moving swiftly and silently toward Betty's room. The door was cracked open. A dim nightlight painted the room in pale gold, casting long shadows. Betty was sitting upright in bed, arms wrapped around her bear, tears streaking down her cheeks. She was crying in that way children do when their dreams betray them, confused, frightened, alone. Sandra crossed the room in 2 quick steps and sat down beside her. Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling the trembling girl into her arms. "It's okay. I'm here. I've got you." Betty buried her face in Sandra's chest, her small body shaking. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't go. Mommy, please, don't go." Sandra's breath caught. She held the little girl tighter, rocking her gently, fingers running through her curls. "I'm right here," she murmured, her voice cracking just slightly. "I'm not going anywhere. You're safe." Neither of them saw Nathaniel standing in the doorway, frozen in place. He had heard it all. The word, "Mommy," his heart slammed in his chest like a drum. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply turned away and disappeared down the hall, his face pale, jaw clenched, eyes hollow. The next morning, Sandra came downstairs early, as usual. The kitchen was silent. The dining table was untouched. No folded napkin, no footsteps, no coffee brewing. She made breakfast anyway. Betty came down, rubbing her eyes, still sleepy. Sandra helped her into her chair, poured her cereal, tied her shoes. But Nathaniel did not join them. Not that morning, not the next, not the one after. When Sandra passed him in the hallway, he offered only curt nods. His tone had gone quiet, clipped, polite. He no longer lingered after dinner. No more candles, no more jazz. He had vanished into his own home, leaving her with a child who still reached for her hand, who still asked for bedtime stories, who still laughed when they baked. But the warmth was gone from the space between Sandra and Nathaniel. It had been replaced by something she recognized too well: distance. At first she thought she had done something wrong, but deep down she knew. He heard her, heard Betty call me Mommy. And that word, one that had brought Sandra unexpected warmth, had broken something in him. One evening, a few days later, Sandra wandered down a hallway she had not explored before. She had meant to find the linen closet, but the house was full of doors, and not all of them were open. She found one that was slightly ajar. Curiosity tugged at her. She pushed it open gently. The room was untouched. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with medical journals and fiction alike. A pair of reading glasses rested on a desk, next to a half-used notepad. The bed was neatly made, the comforter tucked in tight. A framed photo sat on the nightstand. Nathaniel's wife. Young, dark-haired, with eyes that smiled even through glass. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. It was as if time had paused in here, unwilling to move forward. Sandra stepped inside slowly. She did not touch anything. She just stood there, her arms at her sides, her breath caught somewhere between guilt and sorrow. "You found it," she turned. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. "I haven't changed anything," he said, his voice low. She was everything. Sandra looked back at the room, then at him. "She must have been wonderful," she said softly. "She was," he said, eyes distant. "She was brilliant and kind and stubborn as hell." Sandra smiled, just a little. "She would have hated this," he added, gesturing around the house. "The silence, the cold." She liked noisy mornings and bright rugs and dancing while she cooked. And now, I cannot even take down her photo. "You do not have to," Sandra said. "But Betty, she still needs someone, now. So do you." For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing. He looked past her, into the room that once held his whole world, and then at the woman standing in it, not as a replacement, not as a threat to memory, but as someone simply willing to be present. "I am scared," he admitted quietly. Sandra nodded. "Me too." She left the door open behind her when she walked out, and somehow that made all the difference. The days after that night in the closed room were tentative. Nathaniel's walls had not fully come down, but something had shifted. He no longer avoided her eyes completely. Betty seemed lighter too, as though she sensed an unspoken truce between the two people she loved most. Then, one Saturday afternoon, winter sunlight spilled over Central Park. The three of them strolled along the snow-dusted paths, Betty in Sandra's arms, giggling as Nathaniel brushed crumbs from her cheeks after she devoured a cookie. It was a moment so small and ordinary that none of them noticed the man with a camera a few yards away. The shutter clicked. 2 hours later, the image was posted on a popular New York social media forum. Billionaire CEO Nathaniel Carter strolls Central Park with mystery nurse. Blizzard romance in full swing. By nightfall, the picture had gone viral. The tabloids pounced. Cinderella 2025? From night shift to penthouse. Is this a rescue or a scheme? In the office on Monday, whispers chased Nathaniel down the hall. He ignored them. But Sandra was not shielded in the same way. At the hospital, a fellow nurse cornered her in the break room. "They're talking about you everywhere," she said in a low voice. "And?" "Nathaniel hasn't said anything to the press?" Sandra shook her head. No, the nurse hesitated. I thought he would have, defended you. Sandra forced a smile and went back to her charts. But a knot had already begun forming in her chest. A week later came the company's annual Christmas gala. Nathaniel insisted Sandra and Betty come. His exact words had been, "It will be good for everyone to see you." Sandra chose a simple navy dress, modest but elegant. Betty wore a white dress with a red ribbon, twirling in delight before they left. The moment they entered the ballroom, conversations faltered. Heads turned. Eyes lingered. Sandra kept her chin high. They were halfway across the room when she caught the low voice of a woman nearby, a senior executive, speaking to a man beside her. She doesn't have a family name. No credentials worth noting. I suppose making a child call you Mommy is one way to secure your place. The words struck like ice. Sandra's hand instinctively tightened around Betty's. She turned toward Nathaniel, searching for some acknowledgement that he'd heard, some defense, some sign that he saw her. But Nathaniel turned away. He began speaking with a potential investor, his tone smooth, his posture confident, exactly as if he had heard nothing at all. The air around Sandra seemed to thin. It wasn't the sting of the gossip that hurt. It was the silence of the man who, once upon a snowy night, had told her she needed a home, and that he needed her. And now, he cannot even say, "I'm not what they think." She didn't cry. She didn't run. She bent toward Betty, voice calm. "Shall we go home, sweetie?" Betty nodded, tired from the long evening. That night the house was quiet when they returned. Nathaniel was still at the gala. Sandra packed slowly, her uniform folded neatly, her small stash of belongings fitting into the same worn bag she had brought that first night. On the desk in Nathaniel's study, she left the scarf he had draped around her shoulders in the snow. Beside it, a letter. "Nathaniel, thank you for letting me spend a few days feeling like a mother, like someone who mattered. I'm not good with explanations, and I don't need protection. But tonight, I realized maybe I never truly had a place in this life you built. Please tell Betty I love her as though she were part of me. Sandra." Nathaniel returned past midnight, his tie loose, his expression weary. The house felt off, the lights dimmer, the air colder. He noticed the open space on the coat rack where her jacket had hung. Then he saw the scarf. He read the letter once, then again. The paper crumpled slightly in his grip. He went upstairs. Betty's door was half open. She was curled under her blankets, but awake, her face buried in her pillow, muffling her sobs. When she saw him, she sat up, eyes wet. "She left because of me?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Because people don't like her?" Nathaniel sat on the bed, pulling her into his arms. His own eyes stung. "No, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She left because I didn't protect her." He closed his eyes against the ache. "Not because I believed them," he thought, "but because I was afraid. Afraid I already love her too much." Snow began falling again outside, coating the world in white. Downstairs, Nathaniel sat alone in the darkened living room, the scarf in his hands. He twisted it, knotted it, pressed it to his face. The silence in the house felt like it had that first night without his wife. Hollow, merciless, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel Carter didn't know how to make it stop. The morning started with silence. Too much silence. Nathaniel woke to the faint sound of wind rattling against the windows. Snow was falling again, thick and relentless, blanketing the front yard in white. He stretched, expecting to hear Betty's footsteps or Sandra's soft humming from the kitchen, but the house was still. He sat up, checked the clock. 7:13 IE-Dem. Too late for this kind of quiet. He stepped into the hallway. Sandra's room was empty. The door was open. No signs of her things. His stomach tightened. "Betty?" he called, moving faster now. "Sweetheart?" No answer. He checked the child's room. Bed made, blanket pushed to the side. Her slippers were missing. So was her coat. His heart dropped. He ran to the front door and saw it, ajar. Just a crack, but enough for snow to drift in and pool on the floor. Panic shot through him. "Ducky!" His shout echoed through the hallway. He grabbed his phone and dialed emergency services with shaking hands, stumbling into his boots, his coat. "This is Nathaniel Carter. I need help. My daughter is missing. She's 4 years old, left the house sometime early morning, blonde hair, brown eyes, wearing a red coat and boots. Last seen? I do not know. Please just send someone." He barely waited for their response. Out the door, into the storm. He slipped on the front steps, caught himself, then kept running, into the street, shouting her name, again and again. "Bakes." Betty. Neighbors peeked through curtains, but no one had seen her. His breaths came in gasps, his voice hoarse. Frozen. The snow blinded him. His shoes filled with ice. Not again. His pulse roared in his ears. Not again. Not again. He stopped at the corner, bent over, hands on his knees, chest heaving. "Please," he whispered. "Not my daughter, too." Then, a flicker, something deep in memory. The bus stop, the bench, the scarf. That night, he took off running, heart pounding harder than it ever had in his life. Blocks passed in a blur. Snow swallowed his footprints before he could look back, and then, just beyond the 4th intersection, he saw her. A small figure in red, curled up on the icy bench, arms wrapped around something in her lap. He slowed, chest burning, legs numb, vision stinging from wind and tears. She was holding a piece of paper. As he neared, he saw what it was, one of her crayon drawings. A family, a tall man, a blonde woman, a little girl in the middle. Nathaniel dropped to his knees in the snow. "Daddy?" She looked up, blinking through her tears. Her cheeks were raw from wind, her nose was running, but her voice was steady. "I wanted to find Mommy Sandra." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, like he might never let go. "I thought she was gone forever," Betty whispered. Nathaniel buried his face in her coat, nodding, shaking, kissing her hair. "I am so sorry," he whispered back. So sorry. Snow kept falling, quietly, around them, but in his arms, warmth slowly returned. Sandra had not planned on staying long at the nursing home. Her former colleague, Margaret, had offered her the spare room just until she could figure things out. The tiny guest space was warm, quiet, and smelled faintly of lavender. But nothing about it felt like home. She had been sitting by the window that morning, watching snow fall onto the nursing home's back garden, lost in thought, when something pulled her gaze to the street. Across the road, by the old bus stop bench, sat a child in a red coat. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. She stood so fast the teacup in her hand clattered to the floor. No, it can't be, but it was. Betty, curled up, arms around her knees, shivering violently, holding a crumpled drawing against her chest. Sandra ran. She flew down the front steps in slippers, coat barely buttoned, ignoring Margaret calling after her. The cold hit her like a wave, but she did not feel it. Her eyes locked on the tiny girl alone in the snow. "Betty!" she cried. Betty's head shot up. The moment their eyes met, the little girl stood and ran. Sandra dropped to her knees in the snow, just in time to catch her, pulling her close, wrapping her arms around her like a lifeline. Betty clung to her with everything she had. "I missed you," the child whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I looked everywhere." Sandra was crying too now, burying her face in the little girl's coat, whispering back over and over. "Oh, I'm here. I'm here. You're safe." Behind them, footsteps pounded through the snow. Nathaniel rounded the corner, his face flushed, hair wild, chest heaving, his eyes locked on Betty in Sandra's arms, and something inside him cracked wide open. He stopped, breathless, then stepped forward. Sandra looked up, and for the first time since she had left, their eyes truly met. Nathaniel dropped to his knees in the snow, not from exhaustion, from something deeper. "I was wrong," he said, voice raw. "I let fear speak for me." Sandra said nothing, her arm still around Betty, her heart pounding. Nathaniel continued, "I thought I was protecting her, protecting myself, but I was just pushing away the one thing we both needed." His eyes shone with something more than apology, something fragile but real. "I do not need a temporary guest or a replacement for the past. I need you." He took a breath, pulling something from his coat pocket, a small box, simple, worn. He opened it. Inside was a ring, gold, understated, familiar. But engraved freshly inside the band were 4 new words. "Second chances begin here." Nathaniel's voice broke just slightly as he said, "Not just for Betty. For me. For us. Stay, not just tonight. Stay for everything." Ah. Sandra stared at the ring, at the man before her, at the child trembling between them. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she reached for his hand and closed it gently over the ring box. "You do not need to ask," she whispered. "We're already home." She pulled him into the embrace, and together, with Betty between them, they held on as if letting go would undo everything they had fought to feel. Snow continued to fall, soft and silent, covering the streets, the benches, the hurt. But in that small patch of the world, something warmer had taken root, something worth beginning again. 1 year later, snow fell softly outside the wide windows of the newly built community health center, just a few blocks from the old hospital. Inside, warmth hummed through the building, bright lighting, soft music, the scent of cinnamon and pine. The ribbon-cutting ceremony had just ended. Staff and visitors stood with cups of hot cider, chatting, clapping, laughing. At the front of the room, a small girl with a red bow in her hair climbed up onto a low step stool behind the microphone. Betty Carter, now 5, stood tall, a paper in her mittened hands. She took a deep breath, then began. "Once I was quiet. Once I was small. But my mommy found me, and now I stand tall." A hush fell over the crowd. Betty smiled brightly, then turned to glance at the woman in the front row. Sandra stood beside the podium in her white nurse's coat, the embroidered name on her chest now reading Sandra Carter, RN, head nurse. Betty cleared her throat and added the final line. "Mommy gave me a voice. Now she helps others find theirs." The applause was thunderous. Sandra laughed, cheeks pink, eyes glistening. Nathaniel, standing beside her, reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. Later that evening, at home, the family gathered in their warm living room. Stuart came into the living room. The tree stood tall by the window, lights twinkling, ornaments gleaming gold and silver. Betty hung the final ornament, a glitter-covered star she made at school, near the top, with Nathaniel's help. Sandra sat on a cushioned chair, her legs tucked under her, holding a cup of cocoa. Her hair was tucked behind her ears, a gentle smile on her face. Nathaniel sat on the rug beside her, leaning back against her legs. Betty nestled between them, one hand playing with the edge of Sandra's sweater. Outside, snow danced against the glass. Inside, everything was quiet, but not cold. Not anymore. On the wall above the fireplace hung a new painting, soft watercolor strokes of 3 figures standing beneath a snowfall. A man, a woman, a child, all holding hands, all smiling. A family. Betty yawned, her head resting on Sandra's shoulder. "Mommy," she mumbled sleepily. "We have everything now, right?" Sandra kissed her hair. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "Everything we need." Nathaniel looked up at her, eyes warm. His voice was low, steady. "Home," he said, "is not a place. It is you." They sat there, quiet and whole, as winter wrapped the world outside, and inside the lights glowed on, soft, golden, and full of second chances. As the snow settles and hearts find their home, we're reminded that sometimes healing begins with a second chance, and love begins in the quietest of moments. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story touched your soul, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories, where every tale is crafted to warm your heart and remind you that love, in all its forms, still exists. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment that might just change your life. Until next time, stay warm, stay kind, and keep believing in the power of stories.